Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Barbara Schulman and Salas are human rights activists who've translated international treaties into proposed legislation, and they're bringing that legislation to City Hall. Actually, you're bringing it this week, the end of the week, right? So tell me, explain international treaties.
Well, there's a lot of folks actually in the country right now who are really trying to look to the international human rights system for standards and tools that can help solve problems that have been kind of stubborn and hard to solve with our traditional constitutional jurisprudence here and our standard Bill of Rights and the mechanisms that we have.
So does it come out of the UN?
It actually, the treaties that we are bringing here to New York City, one of them is called the Women's Treaty. Its formal name is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women,
and that's
CEDAW. CEDAW, and a lot of folks know about it here in the States because the U.S. is one of the only countries not to have ratified that treaty.
Out of how many countries?
Out of roughly now about 10 countries. It's the only developed nation not to have ratified that treaty.
That's interesting.
It's very interesting. We can talk a little more about that later if you like. The other treaty that we're working to bring here is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or CERD. And those are two treaties that are in the family of treaties that derives out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that actually was developed in 1948,
really
adopted by the
new United Nations.
New United Nations right at that moment. It was there at the birth of the United Nations.
Eleanor
Roosevelt was instrumental in helping to develop the United Nations and the human rights system. It was in the wake of World War II and a lot of the atrocities that had been committed, and people all over the world really felt that it was critical to put into place a kind of international agreement, mechanisms for working together to ensure that those kinds of atrocities would not occur again.
Signed that.
The United States was party to, actually helped develop, really even more so than signed it. The United States helped develop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not a formal treaty. It's actually considered to be customary law. It lays out the vision and the foundation for all the treaties that derive from it that are more formal mechanisms and formal legal instruments internationally that countries then choose to sign on to.
But then, Deanna, I mean, you come from the women of color group and have done a lot of work on it, but if we have that basic treaty about race and discrimination, and then we have human rights laws here, what's the difference? Why are we pushing for this?
Well, the major difference in the city is that the human rights law that they have is still based on civil rights litigation model. It's discrimination happens first. We consider that a human rights violation, and now we're going to sue you. I mean, basically, that's the gist of it. If I'm getting it correctly, I mean, that's what the human rights law does.
It has to happen.
It has to happen.
It's kind of an after-the-fact model.
It has to happen.
It's an after-the-fact model. It's really an enforcement model. It's a model where people have a grievance and they have some place to actually express that grievance. What's really, really unique about the international human rights system and why a lot of people are looking at it and why we're looking at it here is that it's a proactive model. It's a preventive model, and the obligations are there on states, typically in the UN structure, because that's where these treaties are really negotiated. So this is really adopting a new strategy for bringing those tools down to the local level and using them on the grassroots level as a bottom-up strategy, right? So it's using them in a very new way. Not the way they were necessarily intended because people weren't thinking along those lines, but actually it's very visionary to use them in this way.
It's really a way of changing consciousness.
It's a new tool. It's about transformation of consciousness at the local level. It's about trying to inculcate a different way of thinking about what government is for and what the obligations of government are vis-a-vis the people that they serve.
So this legislation you're bringing is a combination of both.
It's a combination of both, and it also takes into account the current protected classes under the city's human rights law. So those disabled, those gender identity, all those are still protected classes, and we've incorporated both CEDAW and CERD with those protected classes to make sure we don't leave anyone behind.
So you bring the women and race.
Women and the women and race, the two, as the two treaties that were merged together, and then in each and every factor of that legislation, it says, and every other protected classes in the current human rights law.
Is people of color enough of an umbrella term to include everybody?
No. No.
To include everybody, how do you mean everybody?
Well, I mean,
everyone who's affected by discrimination in the city? No.
No.
Absolutely
No, it
not,
doesn't.
because there are other
It
folks
doesn't.
who are affected by discrimination. There are, you know, if you're experiencing sex discrimination, but
No,
you're
I don't
not a
mean
person-
that, but I meant of color. I mean, people, from
In other words, is that
different colors.
the preferred term?
Yeah. Is it the term you use for African Americans, for all the
Yes.
different kinds of Latinos, for Asians, for...
See, that's hot. The only reason why I say that is because, I mean, I'm from the Women of Color Policy Network, and it's a debate going on within our own organization of what constitutes a woman of color.
Right.
Among Latina groups, I'm a Latina, I'm an immigrant from Ecuador. Women of color, to me, translated, literally means a black woman. And that's how it's seen among a lot of immigrant populations, because a woman of color from our own countries means a black woman. And then it's also, I mean, and it's more about educating people and coining this term and taking it as their own. This is a collective term.
Yeah.
It's no longer, you know, just historically oppressed groups in the United States.
Right.
It's not just black and Puerto Rican women. Now you got a whole new slew of
everybody.
Asian groups. It's
Right.
Actually, we were just at an event a couple of weeks ago. We did a panel, and there was a young Roma woman who came up to us to talk to us after the panel, and we were talking about whether Roma actually would be considered. Roma is the self-chosen name of people who are considered to be gypsies, and there's a lot of organizing that's
That
going on
comes from
internationally
Romanian.
amongst
Does it
the
come from
Roma
Romanian?
because they experience a lot of discrimination and marginalization. They're displaced constantly. They're harassed. They're persecuted everywhere they go. And this woman came up to talk to us, and we were talking about the politics of racial identity around Roma identity and whether she actually could work with the Women of Color Policy Network.
And I told her, sure,
Absolutely.
Right.
Because
Why
race
not?
is a contested term. Its boundaries are fluid. It's changing all the time, and people
Well, now, how
can
did the
choose.
two of you get into this? We'll come back to the legislation in a minute, but I'm so interested what your backgrounds are and what's motivated you to really understand this and how deep you are into it. So where'd you come from, Barbara?
I
Or
have
how
a
did you
long and
come
checkered
to all of
history.
this?
I've been an activist for most of my adult life. I've also worked in academia. I taught in women's studies for quite a long time and ran a women's studies program in Massachusetts. I only moved to New York about 2.5 years ago. I was living in Boston for about 20 years, doing a lot of different kinds of activism there. My own interest, a lot of the research I did and a lot of the activism I did was focused around issues of gender-based violence, but as those really connect to histories of racism and colonialism in the United States. I was trying to kind of help, along with a number of other people who've been doing that work, to expand our understanding of what direct violence means in women's lives and how we understand it and how loaded it is with information about race and culture that often isn't necessarily on the table when there's discussions about violence.
When you talk about
against women.
gender-based violence, what do you mean?
It could any range. It can mean intimate violence. A lot of the things that people think of when you say violence against women here in the U.S., people typically think of, and this is in part because the movement itself framed the issues in this way, domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, acquaintance rape, etc. For many women who work in other parts of the world, and actually many women of color in the United States, the term also really does include violence by state actors, violence by police against them, violence by prison personnel if they are incarcerated, violence at the borders of our country where policing of people coming and going takes place. So a lot of immigrants, not all immigrants, a lot of immigrants of specific racial groups and specific national backgrounds are experience violence in those exchanges at the border. Yeah. And so it's really...
The tribal rituals and stuff.
Actually, and in lots of places around the world, you know, women are struggling with other forms of violence that, you know, that arise from specific kinds of cultural arrangements, community violence, etc. And so it's just a way of getting people to think a little bit differently. Here in the U.S., I think we've focused almost exclusively on domestic violence and sexual violence and rape and sexual assault, and not really thought a lot about the women who are experiencing violence from all sides, you know, that is from people who are supposed to protect them, like the police, and people who are in their families and communities. And so I was working on those issues. Then I was teaching a lot of classes that also were looking at transnational feminisms and global feminism across borders, and thinking about histories of colonialism and how they affect women's lives everywhere. If you live in a post-colonial context, what that really means for your life that's different from someone who comes from an industrialized former colonizing country, et cetera. So, you know, just a lot of those issues have been up for me for a long time. They've been infused in my activism and coming to New York, I heard about this project here that had just been launched to try to look at these human rights treaties and figure out ways to localize them and make them meaningful for people here in the city. And I was fortunate enough to really hook up with, I was working at Amnesty International for a while, which is one of the partner organizations coordinating the effort. There's 6 coordinating organizations now and about 65 endorsing organizations that we've kind of picked up and done work with over time. And I really am thrilled because it synthesizes a lot of my interests. It pulls together the international
like
and the local.
And all these different
and
organizations.
It connects the dots. I find the human rights framework really it's a really unusually helpful vehicle for doing multi-issue cross-constituency organizing, and that's always what I've been interested in and always what I see the obstacles against. So I've just been really delighted to be able to work in it and work with people like Deanna and our other colleagues.
All right, now Deanna, how did you come to this? You came from Ecuador. How old were you?
I've been in the country for 10 some odd years.
And where'd you live?
Guayaquil.
What?
When I came here? No, when I got here, I'm sorry. We first moved to Astoria, then we moved to Bushwick, and then we went to Woodside. And
you live with your family?
I was. Now, no, I came last, actually. So I was the last to arrive. My little brother was born here, and each of us came like every 2 years. There's four of us. 4 children, I mean. I'm sorry. So we've been moving around a lot. I ended up going to Queens College. To start my activism career, I started under animal rights. That was my thing.
Animal rights.
Animal rights.
All right.
Because
she threatens to go back to it when she gets frustrated with human beings.
I say, I'm done with the humans. I'm back to the animals.
All right.
But no, I started my career literally in high school, junior high school, doing animal rights. I was raised very rurally, so we have an appreciation that people don't seem to have here with animals, with meat, with anything actually. But anyway, So
another subject.
A whole other subject. Then I started to realize that the animal rights movement was very, very fragmented because they were always working under the assumption that people actually knew what rights were. And I think my biggest thing that I had to fight for was, as a woman, as a young woman, as a Latina, as an immigrant, it was always, well, let's put you in to talk to your quote-unquote people. Because they don't seem to understand, why they shouldn't be drinking milk or why they shouldn't be doing this. And then I started to realize, actually, through conversations, why the hell would they understand when they can't get meat on their table, they can't get food, they can't even get regular good milk on the corner store. Their issues are very different. And that's when I started to shift away from animal rights protection, because I don't think that you can protect animals until humans recognize their own rights and therefore say, we can now transfer those to other beings. So that's how I started. And then I started really working on student government issues because I went to a CUNY, and CUNY's always been underfunded. It's always been looked down upon in terms of the city. And I went to Queens College, and it was the best academic experience I've ever had. And I went to Cornell originally to do veterinary medicine and came running back down. And you can't even fathom the difference. Queens College was the best place ever, but underfunded, completely ignored.
It still is one of them. Right. The CUNY system.
I love it. We were discussing the PhD, maybe coming to CUNY. Then I went to the Wagner School for Public Policy, thinking that was a way to really deal with
graduate school at NYU.
Graduate school at NYU, to deal with the structural issues that I was seeing, particularly women face in the city. The fact that the policymakers aren't paying attention. So what best way to do that but to try to be a policymaker? Or at least be a policy researcher. So I went there and I found Walter Stafford, who had just started this Women of Color Policy Network organization. I was a research assistant there.
He's a professor.
Professor at the Wagner School, Urban Planning and Policy. And I worked on the document, 2/3 of women in the city are women of color, still invisible in policy. And we had all the hearings at the Women's Issues Committee, that was your former committee, through Tracy Boylan. And they found us, Barbara Schulman and the other coalition members were like, this is the kind of stuff that we kind of need to say, this is why you need a mechanism within city government that collects data, that shows the discrepancies and the gaps in services, in employment, in practices. I mean, the discrimination across the board, women of color are just not doing fairly well in the city. And that's how we got merged into this. And it was a natural fit. It was such a natural fit.
It is a natural fit. So now let's talk about the actual legislation. But first, there's a model for this.
Yeah,
in
there
San
was a
Francisco.
precedent. Yeah, actually, there's several now.
Yeah.
In San Francisco in 1998, it was post the Beijing Conference for Women, which was held in 1994. It was a UN World Conference on Women, and it was the fourth of one of those. Every 10 years, when those conferences happen, they've just become bigger and bigger phenomena. They've networked more and more people, and they've just been a real incubator for a lot of women around the world to kind of figure out how to strategize better about the things they need to change at home, to talk through talking to each other and learning each other's lessons and so on. And so after that conference, there's a lot of women's organizations around the world that have really been using this women's treaty that we described before, CEDAW. Their governments have ratified CEDAW, and they can use CEDAW as a result of that as a tool in their countries and communities to try to leverage change on the ground and to try to get the kinds of resources and services that women need, and try to get local and state governments and their federal governments to really use a different lens for how they think about women's issues and what are the different kinds of issues that face women in those contexts.
So tell us what difference it made in San Francisco.
In San Francisco, what they did was they actually decided that they were the first to really say, let's look at this treaty and not just say, we want to pass a resolution in San Francisco to urge Congress to federally ratify the treaty. We want to see if we can make the treaty work here in San Francisco, in our city, and improve women's lives here. And so they did a campaign. They were very smart and very successful. They won over the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. They had a great hearing where they had a lot of folks who run different city agencies there who participated, heard a lot of testimony, and they got a unanimous agreement at the end of that hearing that the city needed to seriously look at adopting CEDAW standards. And they moved forward from there, and they got a vote in Board of Supervisors there. What they decided to do, and this is the hard part of doing this work actually, it's about figuring out how to translate these great abstract concepts of equality into nuts and bolts mechanisms that you can use at the local level. And what they did was very smart. They decided that, they looked at what a city does. And what a city does is it just employs people and it provides services for residents. So it's an employer and a service provider. So they wanted to make sure that the treaty standards were brought to the breadth of those government functions. So they said, let's have a set of standards and guidelines that city agencies, each city agency needs to use to look at, to review proactively its policies, its existing policies, through the lens of these standards to see whether they're living up to those standards. Are they actually delivering the services that women need in different communities? And maybe women in different communities need different services from one another. So are they actually assessing adequately to figure out whether or not they're delivering the right services? Same thing with employment practices. Are they delivering the right employment practices to their employees, to city employees, city workers, that enable women to advance in the workplace? What are the obstacles to women advancing? Obviously, anywhere you look around a city or any other institutional structure, you can see gendered divisions of labor everywhere you look. And you also see structural subordination and salary and wage differences everywhere you look, no matter how you cut it, horizontally, vertically, however you look at the picture, you're always going to see.
The base is always the lowest paying and women.
Yeah.
And women of color.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the top is generally male.
Generally, yeah. But if you look across different sectors also, you can see that some are male-dominated, female-dominated. The female-dominated ones are always lower paying, right?
But we used to have the Human Rights Commission, and then they had another committee that sort of did that. What was that?
The Equal Employment Practices Commission?
Right.
Yeah, it's still in place.
It's still in place.
But so how does this differ?
Well, see, the EPC does auditing for employment practices to deal with the federal legislation that you can't discriminate.
Yeah.
The Human Rights Commission
responds to the complaints.
Through litigation.
So are you going to find an ability in this to fund local organizing to go up? Or is it just
to fund local organizing?
Yeah, or is it going to have to be a mobilization without money? Yeah.
There's going to be look. Everything about this is everything about politics is a mobilization.
Yeah,
you know that more than anyone else.
Is a mobilization.
What could you ever do without your constituents when you were in city council, right?
And if you didn't have them, you made them up.
Exactly. Yes, you do.
I used to have all these long discussions with Bella Abzug about the troops and the grassroots and everything else, and boy, was she a master.
Yeah, you need a mobilization.
Magnifying it, right?
Which actually is why our strategy has been a dual strategy.
The concept always is to make a lot of noise outside, so you attract the attention of the people inside, and then finally you get them to move.
There you go.
Yes.
So it's a very simple model.
It's a very simple model. That's precisely the model that we've been following. That's why we have 65 endorsing it. We wanted to build a base. We built a base of a lot of advocacy organizations who are dealing with the city on a daily basis, have no entry point to have these kind of conversations. When policies are failing and their constituents come to them and their clients come to them and complain about what's going on, and they find systemic patterns of discrimination in policy, they have no avenue for actually going to those agencies, sitting down at the table with them and saying, let's solve this problem together.
So this legislation calls for the creation of a board and an advisory board or a task force.
Two bodies.
And it builds the infrastructure that people will be able to come to say, you're not living up to this, right?
So there's the two bodies. One is a task force, and it has more of a monitoring and enforcement function. It oversees the flow, the movement, the forward movement of the legislation itself. And then there is an advisory body that's created by the legislation, and that is, we established that, which they didn't do in California, in part from learning from their experience, because they found that the agencies wanted more help than they could get from a task force, which was overseeing the legislation and had the power to enforce it. They wanted help from another body, and so we created a helping body, a technical assistance body. Both bodies that will help the agency undergo the review process, help them to figure out, how do you apply these standards, how do you use these guidelines and put them into place. And it's a less threatening kind of relationship because they don't have the big stick in a way that a task force does. And so both of those bodies, however, are made up of both city personnel and community residents, advocates, and so on, with expertise in these different areas. So it's an attempt to really create a balance. It's an attempt to break out of the really adversarial model that we have here in the city, which is deeply problematic and is not necessarily the case in every other city. I mean, the context is different other places.
And it also is a framework for changing the way people look at things.
Exactly, because it's not working.
Right.
I mean, people are still suing for the exact same things that they sued 5 years ago.
Right, and waiting a long time.
And individual person gets one win. It's not a systematic, it doesn't prevent anybody else from going through the same thing.
There's something in this also that is like an impact, it's like an environmental impact statement?
Yes,
It's an assessment, that's what your assessment is?
Yeah, so there's an assessment.
As you have new legislation or new regulations, there'll be an
kind of a screening
kind of looking at it.
So that, why bother passing bad policy? Why bother?
Or that
it's a waste of time. It's going to hurt people in the end. Why not actually assess it beforehand?
So this is an enormous new concept, right? And people are going to say, oh, it's going to cost too much money. It's not feasible. It's not that. But what's the process? You've now got the legislation drafted. You know that it's most likely going to eventually get modified to some degree, maybe. But so then you've gotten members of the council, and it's been introduced. Bill Perkins is the main sponsor, and how many other sponsors do you have?
23 as of yesterday, almost half the council.
And you're going to have a hearing on Friday.
Next Friday, April 8th, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at City Hall. I hope that all your viewers will come to the hearing. It's going to be very interesting. We've really tried to marshal, because it's an out-of-the-box piece of legislation. So we're having folks talk about why international human rights, like what do they have to do with New York City? People need to understand why it would matter here. A lot of folks don't really get why it's not just something for somebody in Iraq or Afghanistan. Like, actually, human rights are our birthright here in New York City, just as they are for everyone else around the world. It's the beauty of them, actually. And people really need them here and can use them as tools here. And so that's what we've really been trying to express to folks.
You talked before, Deanne. So this is the hearing's going to be, then you have to get the committee to say what they think about this legislation and to adopt it and to report it out to the floor. So it's a beginning stage of a process. But you need to keep that pressure up.
Absolutely. We've got a great website up now, www.nychri.org, New York City Human Rights Initiative. People should go there. They can write to their council members from the website. They can send an e-card or a letter from there.
Good.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, so I wanted to go back. When you said you made the switch from animal rights to human rights, and that you were worrying about what food was good for people to eat, and then you realized that they didn't even have the food, you meant because they were poor. So,
well, yes, I did mean because how it was working was.
I want to talk about the role of the city, with how many poor people there are, and how many people don't know, and how that affects, and how you relate that to human rights.
I think that the one thing that we do want to say is that this legislation is not calling for particular human rights. It's not saying education is a human right, healthcare is a human right. What it's saying is we need to implement standards of human rights, that before you do anything, see what the human impact of this new legislation is, like you would do with an environmental, and like you would do a fiscal one. They just don't do a human one. And I think that in terms of your question about poor people, they're marginalized. Half of them, I mean, they want to make them invisible. And I think this is one way to take the invisible out of this. I mean, you're one city, and if you have a good governance bill and you have a good city culture based on the basic premise that you are for the people, by the people, to provide services and good programs and policies. If you work under that basic premise, I mean, you would just see, I personally feel you would see a change in the city, because it's not this hostility anymore. You don't feel, I mean, nobody's paying attention. I used to be an organizer. And my people, my poor people, my people of color aren't paying attention to City Hall. They don't care anymore because they haven't done anything for us. And the reality is that it's true. Each and every single time somebody stands on the steps of City Hall, we're going to defend this, we're going to defend that, we're going to defend that. Yeah, you defend it for that one person. Yeah, you defended it for another person. Yeah, they got the $2 million. They didn't do anything for that community.
So you're going to get them involved in politics more?
Well, I mean, what we're trying to do is make sure that yes and no. I mean, there are certain people who don't have time to be involved in politics, and that's one of the things.
They have to be involved in politics.
No, they have to be kept abreast.
We don't have time.
They have to be kept abreast in politics. Then nobody has to be at City Hall the way some of us now are.
Oh, right.
You know, I would hate to pass that to everyone.
Did other people in your family become as activist as you?
They are converting, I'd have to say, because I had a Republican kind of brother and a little brother who was going to be in the police academy, and I was completely infuriated. Not because I hate but that's a whole other issue. But
you need people like him in the police academy.
Yeah, yes and no. But the way they do the training now, I understand why it is the way it is, because he got to even understanding why that culture is the way it is.
We have to say goodbye, and this is a terrible way to end it. But anyway.
Next show we'll go to.
I hope more people like you get involved in politics, and I think we'll follow your trail and see how everything is going through the different stages. And people should go to your website and should pay attention to this.
Or call. You can call if you have no online access. Always call. 646-602-5628.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Ronnie.
Thank you, Ronnie.